events on sustainability and the climate crisis, brought to you by the Loyola College for Diversity and Sustainability and the Loyola Sustainability Research Center. I'm getting a little bit better at trying to say those things quickly. In collaboration with Fourth Space, welcome to this cross-disciplinary webinar where you'll hear from a number of panelists today as they discuss and debate the various visions for the next generation city. Very quickly, Concordia University's Fourth Space is located in downtown Tiohtià:ke, Montreal on unceded Indigenous land. We are an actual physical space on campus. These days, of course, we're operating virtually, and we operate as the kind of the front door to the university, where we invite you to come in and experience any number of interactive live events. And while you're there, perhaps you will learn about what Concordians are working on in terms of research initiatives and course activities. So these days, you can check out what we're doing on social media or on our website. And speaking of websites, just a quick note that we are recording this conversation today and we are live streaming at CU Fourth Space on Facebook. So I'll pop that in the chat. You're more than welcome to join in the conversation today by sharing any questions that you might have for our panelists. Of course, it's a large group and they're prepared to talk, but feel free to interject. And the best way to do so is either to pop a question into the Q&A. If you're a texter, the Q&A box in the webinar is there for you. And if you prefer to join the conversation with your voice, no problem, just raise your little virtual hand and we will assist you, unmute you, and allow you to become part of the conversation. So on that note, I'm passing things over to you, Jim.
Thank you, Anna, and to Fourth Space for co-hosting this event with us. So welcome to our fourth event, last event of the day, of our second day of a 5-day conversation on sustainability and the climate crisis. I think we've got a really lively event for us to end off the second day. I'm told it could be a discussion, debate, conversation. Any of those words seem to work well. And let me just briefly introduce the panelists. Dr. Ursula Eicher will speak first. She's a Canada Excellence Research Chair in Smart, Sustainable and Resilient Communities and Cities, and is Director of the Next Generation Cities Institute here at Concordia. So joining Ursula are 4 other panel members who are members of the Cities Institute. 3 we have already, so I'll introduce Dr. Carmela Cucuzzella, Dr. Janis Timm-Bottos, and Dr. Erkan Yonder. We may have a 4th panelist join in. So without further ado, I'll turn things over to Ursula to kick off this conversation. Thank you, Ursula.
Thank you for this introduction and welcome to a discussion of the Next Generation Cities Institute and our vision of a next generation city. Because if we talk about sustainability, of course, we talk about cities because that's where most of the emissions that cause the climate crisis are generated, but that's also where most of the wealth is produced. Most of the income, the gross domestic product of many countries, of most countries, are produced in cities. So I think it's more than timely that we talk about the very important role that cities have in the next generation city. And I don't know whether you see my slides already. It might be a bit of a delay. Maybe somebody can confirm. Do you see the slide?
We see them if you'd like to go to full screen. Thanks.
Yeah, okay. I went to full screen. It takes time. So when you saw the slides, I mean, on my view, I had planned to do this event alone first. So more than 60 slides. I would have spent the whole hour talking to you. But I sort of stopped doing this since quite a while in these Zoom lives, because it's just so one directional. We don't talk to each other. It's just talking into empty space. So I thought it would be much more interesting to briefly present you the institute that we set up and officially launched in November last year, and then enter into a discussion with the co-directors of that institute. So, I mean, if you talk about next gen cities, we want to move to a real transformation of today's way of living, working, and playing to ecological, healthy, mobile, and inclusive cities. So we really want to ask, what are cities? What and who are the cities built for? So it's not just about smart cities and technological ideas, but we really want to talk on who the city is made for, and our focus is on transforming today's cities that we know are unsustainable for the next generation. And because there's so much action going on at Concordia on cities, long before I came here on this research chair, we thought it would be a really good idea to bring the researchers together and enable this transdisciplinary and cross-disciplinary research, because the challenges that we are facing on sustainable development, zero carbon in the next 3 decades, but also options and possibilities created by AI methods, these can only be tackled if we work together. And if we talk about the city, we're not just talking about the built environment, but also the natural environment and access to green space, up to the arts and design questions. And that's why we thought from the beginning of not just doing a technological, yet another technological research center, but trying to bring in all the disciplines that we have at Concordia, and to see here the way we organize. We are starting to organize the Cities Institute. We have these 3 clusters focused more on the sort of hardware of the city, the built environment, but also the green spaces, natural environment, ecosystem services. Then a more sort of data-driven software of the city that deals with mobility, cybersecurity, and new options of sharing resources by having all these technologies and data around. And the 3rd cluster deals with design, arts, culture, and community, and represents a lot of the work that is done on social justice, on aging in the city, but also on sensory studies or performative urbanism. And so that's already enough for the introduction. So to discuss now where we want to go with this institute, which is really at the very beginning. So it's the perfect moment for you to bring in your ideas. I just show you what we started to do with a lot of the Cities Institute members. We tried to come up with a 4-volume encyclopedia on next generation cities. So that says it all. So we want to, everything that we know, we want to put into these 4 volumes. And we thought today it would be a good idea of talking more on the practical aspects of how do we make change happening. And I think if we talk about sustainability and going to zero carbon in a few decades, which is really not a lot of time, given that we know about the climate crisis since 50 years, I mean, as long as I can think at least, we know about the planets of the limits of growth and the limits of the planet. So we need to make it happen pretty fast, and we need to think of the ways of doing this urban transformation. So we want to talk today about visions and goals of next generation cities. So from the different co-directors that are present here in the meeting. We have obviously a lot of methodologies, but that shouldn't be so much in the focus of today's discussion. I think it's more, I think if we can come up with a picture of where do we want to go and how do we overcome barriers. So you see a lot of ideas that we already collected and want to write about. I mean, lots of barriers, of course, legal barriers, building codes are not what they should be, but also communication barriers, and also solutions, of course. So how do we make it happen? What kind of governance structures do we need? Is it more a city policy problem, or is it a financing problem? So there's a lot of topics that we can talk about. And with that, I stop sharing and would hand over to the next participant of this panel, Carmela Cucuzzella. And I would say, let's have a short statement each of us speakers here in the panel first. And then either you have already posed questions and we answer to those, or we do a second round of comments. So maybe Carmela, if you could give a bit of input on your ideas of visions and goals for next gen cities. Thank you.
Hi, everybody. Thank you, Ursula, for that introduction. Well, there's hopefully the discussion will bring out a lot more than what I'll say. One thing, I mean, if I have like 1 or 2 minutes to say something, one of the things that I think are really important for the next generation cities is that we envision social systems that really can support the flourishing of citizens and communities. In other words, the social systems are part of the infrastructure that we keep talking about. And that flourishing means supporting each other, a high level of social cohesion. And one thing that is really important is that the city is never complete. And this is what we're learning anyway in the next generation cities, is that hopefully the city is never complete, but it'll be an ongoing kind of collective creation with the community. So this is my vision. Okay.
All right. Thanks for this statement. Where I pass on to maybe it would be also good for the audience to understand who's doing what in the Cities Institute. So as I said, we're still in the process of setting things up. So everything is still interim, but hopefully very soon finalized. So Carmela is the co-director of the Institute. And as I explained, we have 3 research clusters. And as far as I see, we have even a representative from each of the clusters here, so you get the full picture. So I would say the first research cluster is the build in natural environments, and there are 2 co-directors, Pierre Gauthier from Urban Studies and Erkan Yonder from the John Molson School of Business. So Erkan, would you give a short statement on your vision, goals of the Institute?
Thank you very much, Ursula, for inviting me for this great discussion. So I want to just talk about the awareness part. So in the build and environmental related to the issues concerning build and environmental stuff, awareness is very important. So I do lots of research at the financial side of sustainable buildings and environmental buildings. There are social aspects. So in general, we live in buildings. Everybody work, live, play, study. Everything we do is in the buildings. We spend 80% of our time in the buildings. So there is a very important footprint. I do lots of research on green buildings and their financial value. And one important thing that we start our discussions or projects is that real estate is responsible for the footprints and carbon emissions and the biggest potential that we can gain for environmental, which comes from the real estate industry. So the built environment. So in that respect, I want to, point out the awareness. So we should make people aware of the environmental concerns and environmental impacts. And we should kind of look into the financial side, solve the financial problems, and try to develop maybe products or help governments and the industry to develop some financial products for more sustainable and environmental investments. That could be a good start. So I want to raise about awareness for sure, so we can have a good discussion on that. Thank you.
Okay, great. Thanks, Erkan. Okay, then we come to the second research cluster of the Institute, which is mobile, secure, and sharing cities. And we have a colleague from computer science, Shun Wang, in the co-director team. And present today is Govind Gopakumar from the Center for Engineering and Society. And Govind, maybe you can give us a first introductory view of your vision of where we should go.
Sure. Thank you. Thank you, Ursula, and thanks to the Loyola Sustainability Research Center for organizing this. And thank you, James, for moderating this panel. My name is Govind Gopakumar. I'm chair and associate professor of the Center for Engineering and Society in the Gina Coady School. And I'm also one of the interim co-directors of the mobile secure and sharing research cluster in the Next Generation Cities Institute. Much of my work has been, my personal research agenda has been on questions of mobility, especially on the politics of mobility, automobility, and the increasing dependence that we have on personal automobile transportation in countries and cities around the world. But as a contributor to the Research Institute, I'm interested in thinking about how the wonderful research that all faculty members who are doing research on mobility, transportation, but also on sharing, as well as in cybersecurity, and the sharing as part of the gig economy, so we're interested in trying to create a platform. This is quite a very diverse research cluster, and we're interested in creating a platform that would bring these diverse faculty members together to be thinking about how you can intervene in managing these different flows of people, flows of goods, flows of data that are intertwined in the city, and then thinking about, who are the potentially different stakeholders associated with these different flows, and how can we think about managing and shaping these flows in a way that makes them more inclusive, makes them more sustainable, and potentially more smart as a result. So I'm happy to talk more about that in the discussion. Thanks.
Okay, thanks, Govind. Okay, and last but not least, we have, I would say, the most important cluster, of course, the design, arts, culture, and community, because that's what makes us all happy, hopefully, once it comes back and springs back to life, and holds everything together. So I'm very happy that Janis Timm-Bottos is here with us. She is from the Creative Arts Therapy and is one of the co-directors together with Megan Joy from Political Science for this research cluster on design, arts, culture, and community. So Janis, we are looking forward to hear your view.
Thank you, Ursula. Thank you all to Fourth Space as well. It's really an honor to be here with this great group of people. One of the things I love about being involved in the Next Generation Cities is the diversity of the interdisciplinarity. I think that we're really born to be interdisciplinary, and our universities tend to put us in silos that are very hard to get out of. So I'm very happy to be here with you all. I've spent my career pretty much studying the necessity of public home spaces in our urban settings. Spent some time working with developers in Albuquerque, New Mexico, and finding that that just wasn't considered. Non-market spaces just don't get considered very much when it comes to urban design. So I would love to envision a city that's actually built for people that have the least. And I bet all of us would be a lot happier to live in it, because it would benefit all of us if we were indeed caring for people who don't have access really to participating in urban life because they don't interact in the marketplace. So whether that's creating more third spaces, I do think that's one of the solutions. Here to share my ideas about that, and also to learn from you all. So I'm looking forward to this conversation.
All right, thank you all for that first round. Maybe I make a short comment as well on my view. I mean, being in the engineering department, I look at the topic from an engineering perspective, and I mean, the whole conference here on the climate crisis, in my view, is very strongly linked to our carbon emissions. And the problem is, we know about this for so long. I mean, as I said, I think all the climate science has been around since the 70s, and still we don't act. And we know, and we already feel and see the increase in weather extremes. So we know it's going to happen. We can measure the temperature increase, and I'm really looking at decarbonization strategies. And I think there's lots of issues, and maybe we can just have a bit of a free conversation for a minute of how we can get that, because I think it has a psychological dimension, because although we know that we are in a crisis, we don't act, because it's still a pretty abstract problem, far away, not so much in our daily lives. And so we still need these the change to happen. Although we as engineers put forward the facts of what to do to build differently, I mean, to change from our way of constructing just this concrete that in the production emits already huge amounts of carbon. I mean, the way we use cars, I mean, and maybe Govind can talk to it. I mean, we're so used to this car-driven behavior, and the way our cities are designed, they're still designed for cars. And although everybody loves cities where you can walk, and it's much more humane, we still don't do it. It's so I think there's a lot of barriers to overcome, although we see how the technological solutions could be by, as I said, using different materials, making buildings much more energy efficient, changing to electric vehicles or hydrogen powered vehicles, or just driving less. So I think we have a lot of solutions inside, but still, and maybe the crisis now helps a bit to break the habits and really think of building back better and coming up with green deals. But so I'm sort of slightly optimistic that we can still do it in time, but maybe we can have a bit of a discussion of where you see the main barriers, or even solutions for change, because I think change needs to come in a big way. It's not just fixing small problems. I mean, it's a pretty fundamental change, probably in many ways. I would say from the heart, the way we have built our cities, we need a very systemic change, but probably also how we organize it socially. Janis, when you talked about inclusion, we are obviously far off a real inclusive society. So whoever wants to, yeah, Erkan.
I mean, yeah, I can start if you would like. So maybe I didn't go into much details of what I do, but I wanted to point out the awareness. I think it's very much related to awareness. So let me give you an anecdote that I experienced some years ago when I was having my PhD. So we organized a green building conference in the finance and economics area some years ago, maybe 2013 or something. I remember there were some papers, projects discussing the financial benefits of investing in green buildings or environmental friendly buildings. And I remember it was like a practitioner-oriented conference, and there was one company manager. I mean, a couple of papers were presented. He asked a very simple question. So, okay, if I invest in an environmental friendly building, or if I invest in a green certified building, will I make money? So, I mean, it took some time to come to this stage when it comes to certified buildings. So now it became the standard in the market. So from the financial side, or from the investor side, first of all, I think that's very important. I mean, that's unfortunate, but I think the investors should be convinced with the financial benefits of investing in sustainable and environmental things. So I had that kind of anecdote or experience at the green building side. So right now what I see is now it's moving towards the carbon emissions. So the industries, institutional investors, developers, real estate companies, they have become aware of the carbon issues. There's huge demand coming from the institutional investors. So it comes to I think demand. So if people become more aware of the importance of carbon emissions, and we should decrease the carbon impact, I think then that will lead to the investors to move into that direction. So what I believe is socially, I think we should create some kind of awareness, and I think our institutes, this institute, can play a great role here to create awareness in that aspect. And at some point, the investors should be convinced that they could also make money out of this. So which means that it should be kind of the market standard. Environmental issues should become a market standard. So there's kind of a path, and I think everything seriously starts with awareness in the markets, awareness among people, which could create the demand. And if the demand is there, then investors can make money also, can make profits. So it's like, there's a good title about it. There are a couple of papers, and I saw so doing well by doing good. So you could do well by doing the good and right thing. So I think that's very important. So from my view, from the financial side, I did some projects. So it starts with awareness, and then it becomes the market standard, and then investors accept it, and the markets they start transforming into the right direction. I think it's very important, and as I said, our Cities Institute can play a great role in this part.
Yeah, Carmela, go ahead.
Thank you. Thank you, Erkan. That's really, thank you for the reflection so far. I'd like to add a little bit to what Erkan just talked about in terms of the real estate and how the investor actually plays a really large role in the next generation city, because it really does. I mean, unfortunately, they actually do. And so let's talk a little bit about what's happened even in the past year. For example, one of the things that investors have felt a lot is that a lot of their office spaces have been emptied out, and more research is showing that office space is never going to come back to how it was before. So all of a sudden now, the investors of these very large empty buildings will have to rethink what is going on in those buildings. Okay, and that's okay. I just want to talk a little bit about the scenarios of some of the different kinds of buildings that have like drastically changed in the past year, but that are huge indicators of what a next generation city could be. Another thing that we've realized is that even our collective buildings, like whether they're condo buildings or apartment buildings, one of the things we've realized, especially in this era of isolation, is that there are not enough social spaces. And when we talk about community and social cohesion and the idea of supporting each other and these social structures that have to take place, one thing that is also painfully evident is that our collective building spaces don't have enough social spaces embedded in there. They have, investors try to maximize their profits, so they try to squeeze in as many apartments as they can in these places without really considering how some of these spaces could be aired out so people can actually hang around and meet each other and become more tightly knit as a community in that building, as a micro community. And so what I'm trying to say is that the idea, so you know how you're talking about the environment, you talked about the LEED certified, then you talked about the carbon emissions. You know what, we need to add other things to that investor profile. That's what I'm saying. Let's add how socialization could become a value added to the buildings, how diverse and mixed uses of these office buildings will actually enable people to come back to the office building and socialize at an office level. Because if you just try to squeeze in too many office spaces, then we lose sight of why people want to come to the office. They want to come because they want to hang out together. And so what I'm saying is, to add to yours, I would add the social aspect, and that as a real value added to the idea of real estate development and developing the next generation city. That's what I want to add.
Yeah, Janis, go ahead.
I totally agree with you, Carmela. I mean, why, to me, I don't understand why bother if we're not going to really make people, especially people that are completely marginalized for interaction in the city, if we're going to completely not involve all of us in the production of living and thriving in a city, I don't know what the point would be. Because certainly making more and more money doesn't solve our problems, especially now. And I think that this whole crisis of COVID has really helped us kind of reset some of our limits. When you talk about market standards, I'm not quite sure where that's at right now, but because that's not my field, but I do really recognize that market standards right now in our city for housing completely eliminates a huge population of people, young people trying to buy their first homes, for example. So I think we need to reset our bars, and those investors that have those big buildings that aren't being used, I think we have the great example of the mall space, which is where we located our first engaged living lab. And we were there for 2 months before we closed down, but the malls are dying, and they have been for a long time. So that's a good example of a very large infrastructure space that's not being used in the way that it could be. So I guess reimagining these spaces and then privileging people whose voices haven't been included in these conversations, as well as the nature and the environment, that we use more than just carbon catching, which I think is very important, of course, but we learn a lot about ourselves and each other by spending time with nature and with the sentient beings that are around us all the time when we walk into our backyard, if we have an opportunity to have a backyard. So I think privileging social spaces, like you were saying, Carmela, is just so critical to a new vision of what matters to a city and to the people in it.
Okay, Govind. Thanks, Janis. You're still muted, Govind.
Sorry, you'd think I'd know it by now how to do this, but anyway, thank you. I think I wanted to kind of jump in on this conversation because I think what Janis and Carmela and Erkan have said, and I was trying to see how I could maybe say something that would string these different conversations together. And it comes to my mind that I think when we speak about next generation cities, but we also speak about transformation, and I think values are something that are heart and center to this process. I mean, we need to recognize that there are multiple values and multiple things that are driving different groups of people. I mean, Erkan, I think, was talking about economic value and how that is such an important kind of driver of change. And both Janis and Carmela, I think, speaking about the need for kind of other social and values of society and equity, which I think are definitely also important. And so when I think about in the mobility sharing and secure cluster coming from there, and I think one of the things that you often have to confront is that there has not been enough of a recognition of the existence of these multiple values in some domains. And I think when it comes to, for example, transport planning, I think how transport planning has happened has often not incorporated the values associated with living close by or using motorized vehicles in order to move from one place to another. And I think that recognition needs to happen much more. And so I think the one point I was going to make was transformation as recognition of multiple values and how we can negotiate bringing those often, into collision in order to think about productive ways forward.
Okay, great, thanks. I mean, what I got from this, I mean, change is certainly driven by demand, and demand is created bottom up. In the end, we are voting for the politicians. The demand might change the rule eventually, but it's a long process. And one of the problems I see that especially the disadvantaged, they don't really have a voice, and they can't make pressure on the financial institutions. And so I think we need to have all different views of seeing how we can bring change. And for example, if you talk about the carbon taxation, which I think everybody recognizes would be a very good mechanism of just making everything that emits carbon more expensive, and that would for sure bring change. But it's been taking so long to come up with a reasonable price that would change the way we use fossil fuels. it's coming, but it's very slow to come. I think carbon pricing is a very good, would be a very good mechanism to drive change much faster than we've seen so far. So I see a bit this problem of, yes, demand drives change, but if demand means convincing every individual citizen that we should behave and live and consume differently, it just, as we've seen, it's just taking very long. So I'm a bit skeptical that it will all happen bottom up. So I think we also need to talk a bit about the role of regulation and, yeah, regulation. Maybe we can have a little round of discussion of where you think regulation could really help to increase the speed of change that we need. Because incentives, I think, are good, but maybe don't do the job.
Yeah, I mean, I can also add about, like, I think that's one of the obstacles about the social side. So measurement is also very important. Benchmarking is very important as well. So with social aspects, it's not very direct or straightforward to quantify the social impacts. I think that's maybe one of the directions that our institute can contribute as well. So kind of benchmarking social issues, social aspects, trying to quantify things and trying to communicate those impacts could be very helpful as well. Especially like Ursula, maybe it could also be connected to your point. So maybe it could also help directing the governments about developing the right policies. If something is more measurable, I mean, these things can be related to, for instance, measuring carbon emissions of a building, so, or measuring, you know, water consumption or electricity consumption of a building, and making this public information. So these things could increase awareness. I think this also holds for the social aspects as well. So somehow, if the social impacts could be measured and could be communicated in one way or another, so that could also put maybe some pressure on the politicians to develop such policies. And maybe, as you said, the kind of government interventions can help also push the industries at the same time. So I think measurement is also one aspect that could measurement could be a one good channel, or benchmarking could be a one good channel to motivate governments interventions or also the industry at the same time. So that's also something I see a lot. So it's something missing that I see also in the financial side. There's not much discussions on the social impacts because there are not many measurements or benchmarks for the industry to connect those dots. So I mean, that could be one aspect that we can contribute as well.
Okay, go. I just wanted to add another thing about regulation that but is always contentious, because, you know, you talked about we vote people in, so there's always that balance between the person that we vote in, the regulations that get put in place, and his or her or their ability to get revoted back in. I think that that's what slows everything down, is the need for these politicians to get voted back in. Okay, so that's why we do have, and so whether we like it or not, we do have to have a bottom-up approach, because we need to convince the people to vote for the right people, for the right actions, and for the right regulations. So I just wanted to add that, you know, because yes, it's, of course, regulation will help, but they're always afraid of getting voted, and we need to vote for them. So to vote for the right people, well, it's the community.
So
okay.
we should increase the awareness in the community.
Yes.
Into that
Yes.
right?
Yes. And that's really it's hand in hand. And I always think of the problem of not diversity, is density. You know, density would help so many problems in the city, yet communities always reject it because it's like, I don't want more buildings in my backyard, but okay, we're not going to put a 25-story building. Could we talk about density? So it's just the question of making sure that we have the right conversations with everybody. And that's why community is so important. And that value, what Govind said, the different values. I mean, it's all that complexity, all that kind of systemic kind of shift that has to take place. It's a mindset. It's not only an infrastructure thing, you know, that's what I'm saying.
Could I jump in here? There's an interesting a question in the Q&A that relates to a lot of what you're saying, including Govind, I think. It's Tristan says, in regards to transport planning, which is central to a lot of this, many panelists might be able to find where efforts often get muddled. For example, in Montreal, we have the REM, but there's literature describing it as actually counterintuitively damaging to our local environment. Where in the process of planning are folks taking a wrong turn? Were there not scientists at this meeting, or more surveys needed in advance, or what's right and what's wrong with that kind of planning in each of your views, I guess, because you have all different takes on probably the RAM.
Could I jump in very quickly on this? No, I think it's a very great question, and it kind of ties to the point that I was about to make also, because I think when you think about regulation and kind of institutionalized processes of making change, often the change happens very incrementally, and it's guided by particular means and routines through which, processes through which I think experts make change. And when I'm thinking of a project like the REM, I'm thinking of, it comes from a particular perspective of transport planning. And for that, I think questions of education, of how planners and to some extent engineers are educated within their curriculum. And speaking from a university perspective, I think that's where it's important to have much more of these kinds of interdisciplinary efforts which broaden, which are predominantly, I think, even when it comes to transport planning, it's still very predominantly very supply oriented. So if there is a shortage in demand, if there is a shortage in, say, the supply of roads or of transit, the solution is, and the classical solution would be, to provide more of it. So if there are a lot of automobiles on the road and there is a shortage of road space, increase the amount of road space available, either through highways. And then now increasingly in the context of sustainable transport planning, I think there is a recognition that there needs to be more kind of diverse means of transportation. And that, I think, is a good aspect of this shift. But the REM, I think, is also part of this idea that you can solve some of these issues through mega projects, and mega projects that will allow cities to potentially guide how transportation happens for several years to come through a project like the REM. I think it's very capital intensive, but I think the question that we need to ask when it comes towards next generation cities is, should we be allowing supply to happen in particular directions and through that reinforce the existence of certain systemic directions, or should we be shifting those directions in ways that are more sustainable or equitable? And those kinds of questions often do not come into the question when transport planners are making decisions about, what is the solution between, when there is a lot of congestion on road space, the classic solution would be, let's provide a mass rapid transit system. Now, is that the only solution? Are there other means of managing demand and thinking about whose demand are we trying to address? And I think that question is often not also addressed. And so all of this, I think, goes back to the question of training, and training of the future transport planners, training of the future transport engineers. And what is the role of getting them to think about the multiple kinds of values that are associated with moving people around in a city? And that's, at least to my sense, is where educators like us come in, and where something like the next generation cities could come in.
Does someone want to come in on that as well? I have others ready to ask you questions too. So how do you feel, Ursula?
It's Janis. Janis was.
Go ahead, Janis.
So just really briefly, I guess I like the thought that some big projects can be considered through, how many different types of people are being served. Like I like that whose demand. I like that question very much, because if it's a demand that solves a large, diverse population's needs, then obviously it would really serve well to consider it. And maybe some of these ideas around regulation as well. I mean, that's a very important topic, and it somehow does fit together with this question as well. But the regulations, of course, are absolutely necessary because we have different politicians with different agendas and different promotion groups that want different things from them. This has all become so clear. The veils have been lifted. We're no longer in the dark about any of this. But do we want our environments to be over monitored? What is a too smart of a city? Is it? And I think this is happening in Toronto right now, where there's a direction change. Is it because of COVID? I don't know the answers. I don't know enough about it, but I do know that they're starting to pull back and thinking differently about what a smart city is, and does that represent too much of surveillance capitalism, or whatever the words are that we use for that. So I think regulation for serving the greatest number of people. Clean water is really important. We saw what happened in the United States when suddenly all the environmental regulations were just lifted. It was horrifying. And so, yeah, that's a very good topic to add to whose city is it anyway?
Others on that topic, or I know Liz Miller has a question for you all, I think.
Yeah, go ahead.
Liz, can we unmute Liz? And
oh, hello. I wasn't, I'm so delighted to be a part of this. And I'm just sort of wondering how communication experts can play a critical role in helping us to communicate our vision for the future.
I mean, maybe I make a short start. Thanks, Liz, for that question. I mean, I would say your help is more than welcome, because at the beginning we all agreed that it's the change is driven by a change in perception of every individual citizen. So unless we communicate and get in touch with them and get them engaged, we won't make a change. So that, I think that's pretty clear, because I think when we discussed about how we see a next-gen neighborhood, I think none of us thought about more sensors and more cameras and more smart things here and there. I mean, we will have a lot of that anyway. So 5G, I don't know whether we still can avoid it. I mean, we will have more data, and in a way, I mean, it offers also a lot of options of sharing resources, of communicating. So we have this smartness anyway, but we need to be careful on the control and surveillance aspect. So, but when we talked about next-gen neighborhoods, I think we were all talking more about the community building and engaging with the people living in that community and making the special spirit and I don't know how to say that in English, the charm of the neighborhood. I mean, that's very much driven by how the districts are organized, but especially the people and the diversity of people living in it. So we need to get to them. And for that, I think we need all kinds of methods and tools to engage. So whether it's film, we're working on gamifying some of our calculation tools so that people can play more with how a city, how the neighborhood would maybe look like, in how they want their neighborhood to look like in 10 or 20 years. So I think we need much more interaction and much more interactive tools and strategies to see what really clicks with people and what makes them excited about change. So that's my little view, and but I'm sure lots of people have something to say on it. Carmela, yeah, go ahead. Oh, sorry.
Thank you, Liz, for that question, and nice to see you. Well, nice to see you here. If I could just add, because the question of communication is super important, and I think at some level it relates to the question of raising awareness that Erkan has been talking about quite a lot, and of which a lot of my work is embedded in the idea of raising awareness. And I'm just going to talk about maybe one angle of it, because there's so many ways of communicating the different kind of futures that are possible in our vision of the next generation. But since we are talking about the smart city, I'd like to talk a little bit about data, and it relates to a little bit of why the shift in Toronto happened. So, there is this idea of data capitalization and the idea that data belongs to somebody. So we do need to find mechanisms to democratize the data. To who does it, like, we need to have the conversation as to, if we're going to collect all of this data across the city, who does it belong to? And so we have to be so careful. And that's why the idea of over smartening, Janis mentioned the idea of over kind of monitoring the city is important, because there's a limit as to what is important. At the same time, what data allows us to do, because we are in that era, what data allows us to do is it allows us to understand a lot of things. It allows us to collect metrics. And so why not be fully transparent with these metrics and democratize that data through artistic practices? I mean, this is a lot of my work, and that's why I feel that I'm comfortable talking about it. The idea of visualizing a lot of the data in public spaces so that communities can interact and understand what is really being collected in the city and why is it being collected and what can they learn from the data being collected. So that's one way, I think, one of many, that where we can communicate with citizens about what is going on and what visions are, et cetera, et cetera. But this, like I said, it's just one potential way forward.
And if I could jump in, it's a great question, Liz. And from my thinking, I feel, communicative strategies, I think, are vital in bringing different groups of people to kind of talk across their differences. And when I think about mobility and sharing, and we're proposing, we've proposed something like a mobility and sharing living lab through the Next Gen Cities Institute, and we're hoping that we would be able to bring a bunch of different stakeholders from expert groups, but transport planners and the transportation bureaucracy, but also citizens, community groups, planners, engineers, faculty members, in conversation around how do we address the question of mobility, and in trying to envision a sustainable and equitable future city. And I think in that context, in bringing these different groups of people together into conversation, I think, how do we have this kind of conversation without thinking about communication strategies? And I think that's where this kind of, I think there needs to be an attention to this in that context.
Yeah, I wanted to add that I don't think communication can ever be unidirectional anymore. I think what you're bringing up is very important, that we need to be communicating with each other. So that means we have less content perhaps and more conversation, so that the multiple ways of knowing can enter into our decision-making processes, and people feel more sense of belonging to the issue itself. So it's not about like having a campaign to convince people of something, because we know that doesn't work, but somehow to have, I believe, spaces where people can have more conversations, more interactions, to be able to hear differing points of view unlike their own, and learning through more of a grassroots method why this is important to them, what matters to them. And once something matters and there's a buy-in and a curiosity that's inspired, and the arts can play a huge role in this, then we have a chance for people to begin to make decisions together so that it's not top down. Great question, Liz.
There's a really interesting question here that I think maybe many of you might want to take a stab at. Ursula mentioned that these changes have to be fast. So here's a question. Do each of the panelists have a favorite city right now in terms of sustainability or change that you look to that we should be emulating? A part of the world where they throw a chef's kiss and say groovy, they're doing good stuff. So I wonder if any of you have thoughts on that?
I can jump in. I had my PhD in the Netherlands. I love any city in the Netherlands. Biking is at the core of everything. I remember when I first applied for my PhD, I flew to the Netherlands to have a meeting with my supervisor. And then I got very much surprised that he came by a bike, with a suit and coming by a bike. So I loved it. So I think Netherlands is doing great in that respect. Like biking is just at the core of their lives, so not much cars. So that's maybe I would say not city, but Netherlands is my favorite in that respect.
Yeah, I can take on this before somebody else catches my favorite cities. I agree with you. I mean, Netherlands, Amsterdam is often quoted as one of the champions of sustainable cities. And I mean, in Europe, of course, there's Copenhagen, also pretty wet city, but very much into cycling and a very strong policy of reducing private car traffic. And what I also like about them from an energy point of view, I mean, they made a decision very early. I mean, I don't know, 30, 40 years ago to go for district heating. And now they have an infrastructure where they can easily change to renewables, and renewable, obviously they have a lot of wind, but they also have cogeneration, and they have these nice distribution networks where they can now replace their fossil fuel plants and deliver the heat to the homes. So I think Copenhagen is a city I really believe can become carbon neutral because they have a good infrastructure to do it. They have a lot of renewable resources, and they're very willing and keen to set the policy. I wouldn't say it's my favorite city. My favorite city still remains Barcelona, and Barcelona is doing good work on a social justice point for sure, but also with the super blocks concept of removing cars in the Eixample. And I mean, it's a city at the sea. Carmela and myself have been talking about that we should find some examples in North America because we're all talking about Europe. So maybe some of the others have some examples that are not in Europe.
But I think, yeah, for Montreal, I think it's important to find, if we want to compare with the conditions in Montreal, it's important to compare climatic conditions as well, because it's a reality. We have very extreme winter climates. And so of course the Netherlands, and yes, they have snow, but they don't get minus 25-degree weather in the winter. So, that's the big deal. So, and even if we want to compare Vancouver, Vancouver has, wonderful climate. It's a very walkable city, because that's why, by the way, Barcelona would be my choice only because of its mobility infrastructure. It is built to be walked. It is built to be enjoyed, to be walked. And there's no other city, I think, that comes anywhere close to Barcelona, because you could never get lost. Everything is, so it's just that kind of city. It was thought to be for people and not for cars, more than any other city in Europe, because I think a lot of the other cities were built for horses. They were built for even before people, But having said that, so in the Nordic country, like, do we want to compare with Helsinki, with with other Nordic, they're great cities too. But again, they're older cities that have been built in the time when the car wasn't prevalent. So that's why it has to be a North American city. And it's really, it's a hard question. So thank you for that. We're going to have to really think about that one.
Okay, Govind, do you want to go? That's
I-
basically final round, so that's probably
okay.
the last.
Well, I actually, I was not sure whether I should contribute, because I personally and as an ideology believe that, you know, one shouldn't compare cities. They're very unique creations. They're products of their particular situations. Like Carmela, you said, I mean, there are some climatic uniqueness about Montreal, but there are also cultural and social and infrastructural uniqueness about Montreal. The other dimension, I think I'm not in favor of comparing cities, because at this current moment, it's all about comparing cities and about learning from cities elsewhere. And I think this is the urban moment when, you know, there's literature on policy mobilities, which kind of speaks about this movement of best practice from one part of the world to another, and the flow of kind of consultants from one direction to another. So I think it's important to think about uniqueness that cities offer, and then I think all cities are, in some sense, in a similar predicament everywhere. I mean, they're all trying to become more equitable. They're all trying to, hopefully, I mean, we are trying to make them more equitable and more sustainable. But to say that one should compare with one city or the other, and eventually the world will compare with European cities, and that, I mean, there are some problematic things about that, and so I'm not going to compare. Sorry.
Okay, Janis, you have the last word of today.
I'm going to have to agree with that. There's so many wonderful things about each city, and when I think about cities I love to be in, they're actually the most diverse. And so I don't, you know, I really hear you about some of the cities in Spain. I think they're incredible. My own city, I grew up in Baltimore. It's incredible. Had so many qualities, and Albuquerque, you know, as well. It's the people that I really, you know, I'm drawn to, and I think Montreal has that as well. We have a very unique twining of different cultures, and that makes it like so valuable. And yeah, but then some of you are thinking about the infrastructure and all the things, so I don't really like to compare them either in that way. But thank you.
Great. Thank you, Janis. Thank you all. Yeah, we all love Montreal. I mean, I came here 2 years ago and I love it better than Europe. So that's my comment. So I think thank you very much for this extremely interesting conversation. It was actually the first time we really had such a discussion of content amongst ourselves. So thanks for the Loyola Center to facilitate that, and of course for space for organizing.
Thank you.
Great, thanks very much, Ursula. There are more questions in the Q&A and the chat we just can't get to, so that's a testament to how interesting the session has been. And I'll remind everyone that we're returning to cities in 2 other panels on Friday morning, a Living Labs panel and an Urban Sprawl panel. So there's lots more to talk about this week about cities. So thank you all for a really stimulating conversation today. Anna, do you want to come
Sure,
in?
why not? I'm here for the party. Thank you, Jim, for the moderation, and Ursula, thanks so much for sharing your presentation time with this group of folks. We really appreciate you all coming on board last minute. And you know, one of the questions that came up in the which was great in the Q&A is about interdisciplinarity and how do you kind of foster that kind of engagement. And while we have the Fourth Space project on campus, the space is there for you. So now, you know, these are one of the many ways that we can kind of activate it. So we were very pleased to be part of this conversation, and hopefully many more to come. Okay, on that note, folks, everybody wants to get outside and get some of that sunshine, so we'll leave you here, and we look forward to seeing you next time again. Thanks again for your time. Take good care. Bye-bye.
Bye.